As an example, for a class that contains static variables and static methods, we need in part A to design a class for a flower, and as usual for part B, we are going to design a class as a demo class that's going to test this class by creating objects from this class. So first we need in part A to create a class. The name is flower, and this class has two private attributes, and here attributes are the data members. So the class has two private attributes. The first is the name and the second is the price of the flower. The class also should include a static attribute that has the name, number of flowers, and this attribute should be initialized to 0. Now for name and price of the flower, the default value for name is rose and the default value for price is 0. But for a price in the constructor or in any other method, if a new price is supplied as an input parameter, then we need to make sure that it is non-negative. Otherwise, if it is in the constructor, we will save it as the default value 0, and if it is in the set method, then we need to keep the previous value of a price as before. So what are the methods that we need also in addition to the data member we need to define in this class? Additionally, the class should also include the following methods. First, we need two constructors. The first constructor is a default constructor that initializes the data members to their default values. And at the same time, it will increment the static variable number of flowers by 1. When this constructor is called, when we create an object, it will initialize the name of the flower to rose and it will initialize its price to 0. At the same time, it is going to increment number of flowers. And the second constructor, it is going to initialize the 3 data members, name and price, and at the same time, it will increment number of flowers. This needs 2 parameters. The first parameter will be for name and the second parameter will be for price. And inside, the static variable number of flowers will be incremented by 1. Also, we need a set method to set both members, name and the price. And if the given values are invalid, for example, if the price is given negative, then we need to keep the previous price unchanged. Also, we need to write 2 get methods, one for returning the name and one for returning the price. So here we don't have 2 separate sets. We have one set that will set both data members name and price, but for getters we have 2 separate get members, one for name and one for a price. Also, we need to write a method for displaying on screen the name and price values of the flower. And finally, we need 2 static methods responsible for the static variable number of flowers. The first one will be for setting a new value, and the second one for getting its current value. Now for the last 2 methods, we have to make our decision clear here whether to include the setter for number of flowers or not. Including getting number of flowers is fine. Why? Because when we get the value of number of flowers, the number of flowers will not change. But when you use the set method for a variable, here you are changing the variable and you have to ask yourself, what is the purpose of the variable number of flowers? Its purpose is to count how many flowers do we have in our program. And you can find this answer by counting how many objects have you created from this class. And this can be done from the constructor itself. So inside the constructor, whenever we create an object, we increment number of flowers by 1. So in other words, we want to say that this variable should be controlled only by the class. It should not be controlled by any other user. Otherwise, we will lose the integrity of its value. So therefore, we should not allow the user to change it. Otherwise, it will not give us the right answer for number of flowers. Therefore, we will skip writing this method. We will provide only getting the number of flowers. Now, as a reminder, if we want to write a static method, remember that it should call only static methods, and it can reference only static variables. And this is why we have to define the getter and setter for the static variable number of flowers as a static methods. Let's go to JGrasp and implement the class of a flower. We create a file for the class by clicking File, New, Java, and now we start typing. So public class, and the name of the class will be flower, F in capital letter, and we start typing the data and the methods of the class. So here we will define the data members, and remember, for the data members, the first one is the name of the flower, which is defined as a string, and the second one will be the price. So private double a price, and finally we will have a private static integer for number of flowers, and in here we have to initialize it to 0 because we are going to update it inside the constructor, and so we have to guarantee it for the first call, for the first object created, that the current value should be equal to 0 and incremented by 1. So therefore, we will start first by writing the default constructor. So here we are going to have the two constructors. The first one is the default one. So we write public, and the name of the constructor should be the same name as the class with empty parameters because this is the default constructor. And remember that the default constructor will put initial values for the name as rows and will put the initial value for a price to 0.0 and will increment number of flowers by 1. So notice this now, the default constructor, if it is called the first time, we have to guarantee that it is equal to 0 and incremented by 1, it will be equal to 1. So therefore, we have to initialize the number of flowers to 0. Now for the second constructor, I will just simply copy the definition for the default constructor, and then we will paste it and modify it. So we will paste it here, and we are going to modify it. So we need to supply the parameters first for the name, and I'm going to call it n name, which n stands for new, and we are going to have double for n price, which stands for new price. And inside we are going to save the new name into name, and now for the price we have to make sure that the input parameter to the constructor is valid. So we say if n price is less than 0.0, then we will save the default value, which is price equal to 0.0. Otherwise, we are going to save into price the value for any price which is provided as input parameters, and we remove price equal to 0 here and increment number of flowers by 1. So whenever an object is created from this class, either by the default constructor or this constructor, in either case number of flowers will be increased by 1. Next, we need to define a set method that set both private members name and the price. So this is like a combined set for two variables. So it will be public, and you know that for set it does not retain any value, and we are going to call it set name and a price. The first parameter will be a new string, a new name. The second parameter, which will be a new price, and it will work almost the same as the constructor. However, we don't increase number of flowers. We will move name in name into name, and we are going to test for any price. If any price supplied as a new price is less than 0, that means it is invalid. So we will display a message by saying that the value you have supplied, which is any price, followed by a message, is an invalid price. So if the input parameter, for example, is -3, then what will be printed? -3 is an invalid price. Otherwise, we will simply copy the input parameter that is provided, which is called n price. We will save it into a price. So this is like a combined, as I said, this is like a combined set method for two variables. However, for these two variables, we have separate get, one for getting the name and one for getting the price. So how to define these two getters? We write public, and since for name it is defined as a string, and the naming style will be get name without any input parameter, simply it will retain the value of name. And here I am writing this just to tell you that we are referring to the variable name inside the class, although it's optional here because we don't have any naming conflict. And for price, since price is double, the naming will be get price empty input parameter, and this will return this dot price. For printing the information, the flower name and the price, we need to provide a public method for printing the name and the price. And usually if we have a method that is responsible for printing only the data member, the value of the data members, then it should not retain any value. We are going to call it a print, and since it prints only the data that is inside the class, then we don't need any input parameters. So we will print system.out.println, where we are going to print by saying that the flower name is followed by the name of the flower, which is name, and we write system.out.println and writing that the flower price is, and suppose it is in Bahraini dinar, then we have to follow it by the price of the flower. So this method is referring to name and referring to price, and these are the only two data members referenced inside this method, so we don't need to include any input parameter. Finally, for the number of flowers, as we discussed, we are going to provide only a get method. And since number of flowers is a static variable, so we have to define the variable that it is going to return its value as a static. And since it is integer, so we are going to say public static int get number of flowers without any input parameters, and inside simply we will just have the statement return number of flowers. And by this implementation of the method get number of flowers, we have finished writing the definition for the class. Now is the time to check that it does not have any syntax errors. First we save it, so we are going to save it, and it should have the same name as the class. And after we save it, we check for errors, if it has any errors, by clicking the compile button, and we are lucky that we did not make any mistakes in the writing of the class definition. In part B, we are going to create a demo class or a driver class that tests the class flower that is described in the previous part. So let us see what is required. First, we need to create an object called flower1 of type flower. Notice here, it did not say, or it did not say the initial, or does not require to initialize the name of the flower by a certain value or the price of the flower by a certain value. So that means we need to call the default constructor to initialize the name and the price of the flower. Name will be initialized to rows and price will be initialized to 0. Also, after we create the object, we need to display the name and the price of the flower that is created in the previous step. And then we are going to ask the user to enter a name and a price for a flower1. So we will create an empty flower object. We will display its information, and then we are going to ask the user to give us a new name and a price, and we will save it into flower1. Let's go to JGrasp and create these three steps. So we click File, New, Java, and we type the class definition, and we're going to call it flower demo class, and inside we write the public static void main string args, and since we are going to read from the user from the keyboard, so we need import java.util.scanner, and in here we are going to prepare our data members. So first is the scanner, and I'm going to call it read new scanner system.n. First create the object flower, and we are going to call it flower1 as the problem statement says, and we will create an object by saying flower by calling the default constructor. And then, so let me write comment here, create a new object of flower, and we will call it flower1. And next is display the name of a price of flower1. And here, how to display the information. Remember, we have a method inside responsible for this. So we say flower1 dot print, because we called it a print. Next, we ask the user, prompt the user for name and a price for flower1. Here we will ask the user system.out.println what is the name and the price for the first flower, or let me see, just what is the name and the price of the flower, of the first flower, let's say first flower. And I'm going to read these two values from the same line, so I will delete ln, and then first we will take this one name, and this is going to be read dot next as single word, and I'm going to define a price double, and this is read dot next double. So here we have created an object, we displayed its information, and we have read from the user for new values, and now we need to set these values into flower1. Remember, we had a method that was called set name and a price, so we are going to use it. So we are going to call flower1 the name of the object, set name and the price, and we give the name and the price as input parameters, and this method will save the name and the new name and new price to the current name and the current price. Next, we need to create another object from this class called the flower2, and at the same time we are going to display also the name and the price for flower2. And remember, the same as step number 1, we are going to call the default constructor. So again, for flower2, when we display its information, the name will be Rose and the default value will be 0. And again, we are going to prompt the user to enter a name and a price for flower2. And then finally, we need to get the method for number of flowers to display how many objects did we create from the class flower. So let's go to JGrasp and do these remaining steps. For the next statements, or for the next requirements, simply we just copy these lines and we paste them down here, and we modify them. So let us modify them. So we will go to flower, and here we are going to create a new flower, which is flower 2, and we need to change also the comments, and here we're going to display flower 2 as well. Prompt the user for name and price for flower 2. So we need to change the message. What is the name and price of the second? Here we are going to say second flower, and we are going to use the same variable, so there is no need to redefine these variables. And we are going to call flower 2 set name and a price for flower number 2. And after that, we are going to print a message for how many flowers did we create, or how many objects did we create from this class. So we will say that the number of flowers is, and we need to display the value for number of hours. Now for displaying the number of hours, remember that number of hours defined as a static variable. So to display this value is shared by all objects created from the same class. So for this particular example, we have 3 ways to print the value for number of flowers. Let me write all of them for demonstration. First, we will access it directly by using the class name. So the class name is flower, and the variable is number of flowers. But that is wrong. Why this is wrong? Because we have already defined number of flowers as a private data member, and now we are accessing that data member directly. So we cannot do that. So we are going to call this method, and we will say get number of flowers with empty brackets. So this is one way to display the value of the number of flowers. The other way is by using the 2 objects. So we have 2 flowers. So the first object is a flower 1. So I'm going to copy the same line, but here we are going to say, here instead of a flower, we're going to say flower 1. And again, we will copy the same line here, and we are going to say flower 2 dot get number of flowers. All of these 3 statements should print the same value. Why? Because they are referencing the same variable, which is the static variable. So let us save the program or the class, and then let us compile it before we run it to test whether we have errors or not. It seems that we have errors. Yes, it seems that I forgot to put dot. Compile again, and again here I have repeated maybe the same mistake. I should press harder on the keystrokes of the keyboard. And what else do we have? It says that we cannot find get number of flowers. In fact, the name of the method is correct, but we made a small mistake here. We should write the name of the object, which is in small letter flower, and here also small letter flower. Now we compile, and now we don't have any errors. Now is the time to run the program. So by running the program, let's run the program. So now here, as you see, we have called the default constructor for flower 1, and we displayed its content. So the name is Rose and price is 0. So now we need to enter a new name for a flower. So let us assume we have Lotus, and the price is 5.6. We press enter, and again we have created a second object, and again the default values for that object, Rose, and the price 0.0. And now it's asking for another flower, so we will call it Tulip, and the price is 8.9, And when we press enter and see now the three methods we have used for printing the static variable referred to the same variable because it was defined as a static. The first method by accessing the static method directly using the class name. The second, two ways by referencing or by accessing them through the objects.